For most people today, ancient Egypt conjures images of towering pyramids, golden tombs, and eternal splendor. Pharaohs ruled like gods, their lives immortalized in stone, their deaths dramatized in rituals meant to grant them everlasting life. But few ever stop to consider who made that immortality possible. Not the priests, not the scribes, but the people who did the dirtiest, most horrifying work of all, the mummy makers. These individuals were not philosophers or sages. They were workers, artisans in the truest and most grueling sense. Their job: to handle rotting bodies, slice open decaying flesh, stir brains into liquid, remove festering guts, and do it all under the scorching Egyptian sun. Day after day, corpse after corpse. Their role in the process of mummification was essential, yet their lives were marked by isolation, stigma, and a constant exposure to death and disease. This was not a noble craft. It was survival inside a nightmare. While society exalted the finished product, the carefully wrapped mummy, nestled in its ornately painted coffin, nobody talked about how it got that way. The truth is far from romantic. The art of embalming was brutal, dirty, and dangerously unhygienic. It was a process perfected over generations through sheer trial and error. And every step was more disturbing than the last. The place where this grim work began was not some pristine temple or sacred chamber. It was a makeshift structure, usually a tent or hut, known as the wabet, the house of purification. Situated close to the Nile for access to water, the wabet was less like a place of worship and more like a crude butcher's stall. Heat radiated off the linen walls. Flies hovered in thick clouds. The floor was hard-packed dirt, soaked with fluids. There were no windows, only flaps tied open for ventilation. Inside, the tools of the trade lay waiting. Bronze hooks, obsidian blades, rough linen strips, and pottery jars filled with various materials. This was the operating room of the afterlife, and it smelled like death. The body would arrive already, starting to decompose. In the Egyptian heat, it didn't take long. Despite the religious importance of burial, not everyone died in their homes. Soldiers fell on the battlefield. Laborers collapsed far from the city. It might take a day or more for a body to reach the waybed. And by then, the scent was undeniable. Skin discolored, the abdomen swollen with gases, fluids leaking from the mouth and nose. For the embalmer, this was just the beginning. The first and perhaps most infamous step in the process was brain removal. The ancient Egyptians believed that the brain served no purpose in the afterlife. In fact, they considered it a nuisance, a wet, perishable organ that needed to be eliminated before it spoiled the skull. So the embalmers removed it, not with finesse, but with a metal hook. The hook was long and thin, made of bronze and shaped to slide through the nostril into the skull. Once inserted, it was twisted and stirred violently to turn the brain into a soft pulp. Imagine the resistance of tissue giving way, the sound of squelching, the smell that rose up as the hook did its work. The embalmers didn't wear gloves. Their hands were bare. Once the brain had been thoroughly liquefied, the head was tilted and the mixture drained out the nostrils. Sometimes the body was even shaken to speed the process along. It was messy, disgusting, and absolutely necessary. For poorer families, there wasn't always the time or money for such hands-on methods. In these cases, embalmers might use chemicals instead, injecting caustic substances through the nose to dissolve the brain. The result was the same: a skull emptied of soft tissue. But the risks were higher. One misstep, and the liquid might splash back into the worker's eyes or onto their skin, causing burns or illness. There were no protective masks, no sanitation protocols, only a job to finish. With the brain gone, the next step was far more invasive: evisceration. This part of the process was known as the gutting, and it was as horrifying as it sounds. The body was laid flat, and a small incision was made on the left side of the abdomen. The tool of choice was usually a flint or obsidian blade, sharp but brittle. Through this cut, the embalmer reached inside to remove the internal organs: lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines. The heart, however, was left inside. Egyptians believed it was the seat of intelligence and emotion, the one organ needed in the afterlife to face judgment. Removing the organs was not a clean operation. These bodies were not fresh. The embalmer had to push their hands into warm, decaying tissue, cutting, pulling, and scooping with their fingers. Fluids poured out. Bile leaked from the stomach. The smell was unbearable. And yet, this was just another day on the job. Once removed, the organs were washed and dried with natron, a naturally occurring salt with powerful dehydrating properties. Each organ was then placed into a special jar, known as a canopic jar, each protected by a different deity. The lungs went to Hapi, the baboon-headed god; the stomach to Duamutef, who had the head of a jackal; the intestines to Kebesenuef, the falcon-headed protector; and the liver to Imseti, the human-faced guardian. These jars were sealed and entombed with the body, but the man who made the initial cut, the parashistes, was treated differently from the others. Despite doing a necessary task, he was considered ritually impure. In some rituals, he would be symbolically chased away by his fellow embalmers, even pelted with stones. It was a strange contradiction. His work was sacred, but his presence was defiling. After the organs were removed, the cavity inside the body was washed with palm wine and stuffed with aromatic herbs. This wasn't for health. It was to mask the smell. Then came the most time-consuming part of the process: the drying. The body, now empty and hollow, was completely covered in natron. Bags of the salt were packed inside the body, while the rest was buried beneath a mound of powder. It would stay like this for 40 full days. Why 40? Because centuries of trial and error taught embalmers that 40 days was the ideal amount of time to fully dehydrate the human body. Any less, and the tissue might rot. Any more, and the skin might crack. During this time, the embalming tent would be filled with the smell of salt and slow decay. Rows of bodies, in various stages of dehydration, lay covered like salted fish. Embalmers worked quietly, checking each one, adjusting the natron, brushing off mold, shooing away insects. They rarely spoke. Death surrounded them. When the 40 days were over, the body was no longer soft. It had transformed, the skin leathery, the features sunken. This was not the peaceful mummy of museums. It was a dried-out husk, and it had to be made beautiful again. This stage, the final preparation, was known as the beautification. First, the body was washed again, usually with Nile water. Then it was rubbed down with oils and resins, frankincense, myrrh, cedar. These substances masked odor, softened the skin, and gave the corpse a lifelike sheen. The hollow body cavity was stuffed with linen, sawdust, and sometimes even scented spices. The goal was to restore volume, to make the deceased look more like themselves. The embalmers worked meticulously, hands sticky with resin, eyes watering from the smoke of incense. They wrapped amulets in layers of linen, placing them carefully on key parts of the body, on the chest, the arms, the forehead. Each amulet had a purpose: protection, healing, strength. The wrappings themselves were done layer by layer, sometimes hundreds of meters of linen used on a single body. The work was repetitive, slow, and utterly exhausting. Wrapping one mummy could take days. Yet even after all this, the embalmer received no praise, no reward, no glory. For those outside the embalmer's world, the horrors stopped at the surface. The stench, the gore, the endless contact with the dead. But for those who worked within the Wabet day after day, that was only the beginning. There were dangers here that no one could see, threats that crept into their skin, into their lungs, into their minds. Death wasn't just something they handled, it was something they breathed in, something they wore on their skin, something they risked becoming a part of. The first and most obvious danger was infection. In the ancient world, there was no concept of germs or disease transmission, but the dead were teeming with bacteria. When a person died, the body didn't simply rest. It decayed, fast. And inside that decomposition process were microbes and pathogens that could easily jump from corpse to living flesh. The embalmer's hands, arms, and sometimes faces were frequently splashed with fluids. One small cut, one nick on a finger, one slip of a blade. That's all it took. Many bodies carried diseases like tuberculosis or leprosy. Others died of unknown illnesses that left no external marks, but were just as lethal to those handling them. There were no gloves, no antiseptics. If a worker developed a fever, a rash, or a sore, there was no treatment, only the hope that their body would fight it off. Some embalmers died quickly. Others fell into slow decline, coughing, limping, covered in lesions. No one mourned them publicly. The job was dangerous by design, and everyone knew the risks. But the threat wasn't just biological, it was chemical. The materials used in embalming were powerful and, over time, deadly. Natron, the salt used to dehydrate the body, may have been effective against bacteria, but it was brutal on human skin. Constant exposure dried out the embalmer's hands until they cracked and bled. Dust from the natron floated in the air, coating their lungs. Workers developed chronic coughs, rasping breaths, and frequent nosebleeds. The longer they worked, the worse it got. Then there were the resins, sticky, tar-like substances heated over open flames. These weren't just fragrant, they were toxic. The smoke they produced when boiled filled the tent, clinging to everything. Eyes stung, throats burned. Many embalmers developed chronic respiratory conditions. Breathing was hard. Speaking became hoarse. Some even went blind. Not suddenly, but slowly, their vision clouded by years of exposure to caustic fumes and airborne irritants. Occasionally, even more dangerous substances entered the mix. Mercury and arsenic, known even then for their preserving qualities, were sometimes used to treat certain bodies, especially those of the wealthy. But these elements were silent killers. There was no way to detect their slow accumulation in the body. No warning, only symptoms: fatigue, tremors, confusion. By the time an embalmer felt sick, the damage was already done. Add to this the physical toll. A corpse is not light, nor is it easy to maneuver, especially one that is bloated, stiff, or already falling apart. Embalmers had to lift, roll, and reposition bodies multiple times during the process. They had to reach inside, pull out organs, tilt heads, bind limbs. This repetitive strain led to chronic back problems, aching joints, and muscle injuries. Wrapping alone was exhausting. Hours spent hunched over, stretching and tucking linen again and again until every inch of the body was covered. Hands cramped, backs ached, feet throbbed from standing on hard-packed ground for hours. There were no breaks, no ergonomics, no relief, just the next body and the next. Beyond the physical suffering came the mental weight. Imagine spending every day among the dead, not the peaceful dead, but the grotesque dead. the recently stabbed, the plague-ridden, the accident victims, bodies bloated, burned, or mutilated, some so far gone that their features were unrecognizable. These weren't serene portraits of the afterlife. These were reminders of how fragile, how violent, and how cruel life could be. Over time, embalmers became numb. They had to. Emotions were a luxury they couldn't afford. Some stopped feeling anything at all. Others developed nervous tics or fell into depression. Nightmares were common. So was insomnia. There are even reports, rare but persistent, of embalmers breaking under the pressure, speaking to the dead, or developing strange rituals of their own to cope with the horror. And through all this, society turned its back on them. Despite their essential role in the journey to the afterlife, embalmers were viewed with suspicion and disgust. They were considered ritually impure. The work they did, cutting, gutting, handling flesh, was seen as defilement, no matter how necessary it was. They lived on the fringes, often in separate quarters or villages. They were allowed near temples, but only to work, never to worship. Socially, they were outcasts. People avoided them in the streets. Children whispered about their smell. Their clothes were permanently stained with resin and salt, their skin marked by burns and cuts. No matter how clean they tried to be, the stench of death followed them everywhere. It clung to their hair, their breath, their nails. Marriage was difficult. Many embalmers married within their own caste. Other embalmers, or labourers, associated with death. Outside relationships were rare and often met with resistance. Who would want to marry a man who spent his days inside corpses? Even within their profession, hierarchies existed. The parashistas, who made the initial cut into the body, was ritually cursed, symbolically chased away. He was vital to the process, but treated as the lowest of the low. Others in the hierarchy, those who handled the wrapping or applied the oils, might look down on him. It was a brutal irony. The more necessary your task, the more you were shunned for performing it. This contradiction defined the mummy maker's life. Revered in theory, reviled in practice, they were both the architects of immortality and the casualties of it. And yet, there was another dimension to their work, one that pulled them even deeper into the underworld of the dead, the business. Mummification was not charity, it was a service, and like any service, it came with a price. Despite its religious overtones, mummification was an industry. And like any industry, it operated on a system of costs, labor, materials, and demand. Death in ancient Egypt was not only a spiritual passage, it was a business opportunity. For the mummy makers, this meant that their suffering didn't just come from the horrors of the job itself, but from the systems around it that demanded more, faster, and cheaper results. There was no one-size-fits-all service. Mummification came in tiers. The wealthiest patrons, nobles, high officials, and royalty could afford the most elaborate and time-consuming rituals. Their bodies would be treated with rare imported resins, wrapped in hundreds of layers of fine linen, and buried in lavish tombs filled with food, amulets, and furniture for the afterlife. These high-end mummifications were prestigious, and the embalmers took their time. Every incision was careful. Every amulet was placed with symbolic precision. The result would be a mummy that looked near lifelike, with painted facial features and adorned in golden masks. For these, the embalmers were sometimes temporarily elevated in status, though never truly accepted. But most bodies didn't get this treatment. Most Egyptians couldn't afford such luxuries. Instead, they paid for what they could. Middle-tier mummifications were more hurried, using cheaper materials and fewer rituals. In some cases, the body might not even be fully eviscerated. Instead, Embalmers would inject chemicals to rapidly dry the internal organs while still inside the corpse. The external wrappings might be sparse, the resins minimal, and the final resting place no more than a communal tomb or sand-covered pit. Then there were the poor, the majority. Their dead were often treated quickly, with the bare minimum needed to qualify as mummified. Sometimes this meant simply packing the body in natron and wrapping it hastily. No amulets, no organs removed, no oils or resins, just enough to preserve the body for burial. For the mummy makers, these lower-tier clients meant dealing with advanced decomposition, poorly stored bodies, or even multiple corpses at once. There was no dignity in this work. The pressure to move quickly, to clear the backlog of bodies, meant they had little time to process what they were doing. The same brutal steps, performed faster, with less care. All of this took supplies, lots of them, linen, oils, herbs, natron, jars, blades, incense. These weren't always easy to come by. Natron, for instance, had to be harvested in specific regions, often transported over long distances. Resins like frankincense and myrrh were imported from distant lands, making them expensive and sometimes unavailable. When shortages happened, embalmers had to improvise. Lower quality materials were substituted. Linen might be reused. Herbs might be stretched thinner. In extreme cases, jars were faked, filled with sand or pebbles and sealed to simulate a proper burial. This was dangerous territory. If a family found out their loved one was not properly prepared, it could lead to accusations, violence, or worse, the wrath of local priests who governed purity laws. But the worst jobs weren't even for human beings. By the later periods of Egyptian history, a new trend had emerged: the mass mummification of animals. This wasn't rare or symbolic, it was industrial. Cats, ibises, baboons, falcons, even crocodiles. Millions of animals were mummified as votive offerings to the gods. People would buy them and offer them at temples, hoping to curry favor from deities like Bastet, Thoth, or Horus. These animals were raised, killed, and embalmed in staggering numbers. For the embalmers, this meant more work, endless work. Unlike human mummification, which had some level of ceremony, animal mummification was a conveyor belt of gore. The animals were often sacrificed en masse. Some were strangled, others were clubbed or drowned. The bodies were small, but the numbers were overwhelming. Embalmers had to eviscerate and wrap thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of creatures per year. The process was faster and rougher. Many animals weren't even mummified properly. Wrappings were minimal. Bodies were partially decomposed. In some cases, the mummy contained no body at all, just bones, or even just dirt. These fraudulent mummies were sold like holy trinkets. But the work itself was no less revolting. Picture a pile of dead kittens, their bodies limp, eyes still open, or baskets full of decaying birds, feathers matted with blood. The embalmer's hands moved on instinct. Cut, remove, dry, wrap, repeat. No rest, no time, no meaning, just volume. If the human mummies were about dignity and ritual, the animal mummies were about profit and production. And for the mummy maker, both required the same price: their health, their sanity, and their place in society. Even after death, an embalmer might not receive the same rites he had performed for others. His body, viewed as unclean in life, might be buried without ceremony, without wrapping, without a tomb. In a cruel twist, the man who spent his life preparing others for the afterlife might not reach it himself, at least not in the way he was taught to believe. Yet somehow, the work continued, generation after generation. Fathers trained sons. Skills passed down not through pride, but necessity. For many, It was the only trade available. Once marked by the stink of death, there was no going back. In the grand mythos of ancient Egypt, the names of pharaohs were carved into stone. Their tombs were filled with gold, their stories told for thousands of years. But the mummy makers, the men who made all that possible, left no names, no monuments, only the lingering shadow of a job no one wanted to speak of, yet couldn't do without. Despite their critical role in Egyptian society, mummy makers were seen as spiritually contaminated. In a culture that was deeply obsessed with purity, both physical and ritual, constant contact with the dead placed embalmers outside the bounds of everyday life. They were the paradox of ancient Egypt, necessary but unwanted. The impurity associated with touching the dead was not a vague superstition. It was a strict religious boundary. Death was a spiritual disruption, a force that had to be contained and controlled. Priests performed purification rites before and after funerals, and mourners bathed and abstained from certain foods or activities. But for the embalmers, who touch corpses every day, there was no escape from this impurity. It clung to them like a curse. This wasn't just symbolic, it had real consequences. Embalmers were often forced to live on the outskirts of towns, in designated quarters, away from temples and marketplaces. They couldn't participate in many religious rituals. They weren't allowed to touch sacred objects. In some towns, they weren't even permitted to enter certain buildings. Their children might be shunned at school. Their wives, if they had them, faced constant judgment. And yet, the contradiction was sharp. These same embalmers were summoned when a high official died. They were needed to ensure that a soul could pass through the trials of the afterlife unharmed. Their skills were demanded by the elite and the common alike. The society that rejected them also depended on them completely. Nowhere was this hypocrisy more visible than in the treatment of the parashistas. The parashistas was the man who made the initial incision in the body, the one who physically opened the flesh and began the defilement. This was the moment that most clearly violated religious norms. And so, even though he was trained and skilled, even though he performed a vital function, he was ritually cursed. In some accounts, after making the cut, the parashistas was forced to drop his knife and run as fast as he could, while his fellow workers threw stones and shouted curses behind him. It was a symbolic act, a ritual punishment for defiling the body, even though he was doing exactly what they needed him to do. This bizarre performance illustrates just how uneasy the Egyptians were about the entire mummification process. They revered the result, but the act of turning a decaying corpse into a preserved form, that was dirty, dangerous magic. It had to be done, but no one wanted to look at it too closely. As a result, the embalmers lived in a strange shadow world. Not quite outlaws, but not accepted either. Their knowledge was respected, but their presence was tolerated at best. It didn't help that their work was often surrounded by secrecy. The exact methods of mummification were rarely written down in full. Instead, they were passed orally, guarded like family secrets. This was partly to protect their livelihood. If everyone knew how to do it, the service wouldn't be worth paying for. But it also reinforced their separation. What they knew was forbidden to most, sacred, dangerous. Even among themselves, there were layers of hierarchy and mistrust. Apprentices started young, often as boys, and were assigned the dirtiest tasks: fetching natron, disposing of removed organs, scrubbing down equipment. Only after years of silent labor would they be permitted to assist with wrapping or oiling. And few ever rose to the level of full embalmer. Most simply aged into the role by attrition after others died, left, or became too sick to continue. There was no retirement, Embalmers worked until their bodies gave out, hands arthritic, backs bent, eyes burned by resin smoke, and still they worked. Some grew bitter, others grew numb. A few came to believe that they were cursed, not metaphorically, but literally, marked by the gods for a life among the dead. And who could blame them? After all, every day they faced corpses in various stages of decay. Some were fresh, others were horrifying, bodies swollen with gas, oozing fluids, teeming with insects, corpses that had been half eaten by jackals before they were found, victims of drowning, their flesh bloated and discolored, children, infants, whole families. There was no way to avoid the trauma, no room to grieve, no space to feel horror. The embalmer had to distance himself or break apart. In a world so deeply concerned with eternity, the irony was brutal. The men who ensured eternal life were denied dignity in their own. And still the work continued. Because as long as death existed, the embalmer was needed. He could not leave his trade. He could not escape the smell of resin and salt. He could not shake the feel of linen and leathered skin beneath his fingers. It was part of him now, part of his breath, part of his blood. And as the tomb doors closed behind yet another nobleman, sealed for eternity in golden silence, the embalmer would step back into the heat, into the flies, into the makeshift tent where another body already waited. There was no glory, only the next job. If death had a rhythm in ancient Egypt, it beat through the hands of the embalmers. Not the priests chanting hymns in alabaster halls, not the scribes copying spells onto scrolls, but the quiet men, buried in work, who did the impossible. They fought the natural collapse of the human body, every hour, every day. There was something unrelenting about the routine. When one body was complete, another replaced it. When one set of organs had been sealed away in canopic jars, another pile of viscera was being pulled from a freshly cut cavity. Time didn't stop, nor did the decay. Even when the embalmers slept, the bodies they hadn't yet reached continued to rot in the stifling heat. This is the part most people misunderstand, that embalming wasn't just a process. It was a race against time. Egypt's climate, while ideal for preservation in dry sand, was brutal for the living. The combination of humidity from the Nile and scorching sun meant that a dead body could bloat and split within hours. Embalmers often had to work at night just to slow the decomposition, and with every passing hour the job became harder, more putrid, more hazardous, more humiliating. Sometimes bodies were delivered already in catastrophic condition. Travelers who died far from home, merchants whose ships had returned too late, slaves who were found days after collapsing. These corpses didn't come with clean skin and peaceful expressions. They came with maggots, with limbs stiff from rigor mortis, with stomachs burst open from internal gases. And it was the embalmer's job to fix them, or at least make them look whole again. They would patch faces with linen soaked in resin, build cheekbones from sawdust, sew mouths shut, paint lips back into existence. They became sculptors of the dead, not for beauty, but for memory. The body had to be recognizable to the soul. It didn't matter how disfigured it was in life or death. The embalmer had to restore it, but nothing could truly restore the health of the embalmers themselves. Their exposure to rot and fumes came with a cost they couldn't see until it was too late. Many of them developed lesions on their hands that never healed, respiratory infections that lingered for months. Some lost their teeth from constant exposure to chemicals. Others coughed up blood, unable to breathe deeply after years of inhaling burning oils and decayed flesh. They had no physicians, no temples of healing, and no one to care for them when they finally collapsed from exhaustion or illness. For those who endured long enough, the pain simply became part of their day. A raw patch of skin on the forearm, a tightness in the chest, a limp. These things became permanent, reminders that their bodies were following the same slow decline they fought against in others. And yet, perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was that the embalmers left almost no trace in history. For a civilization that documented nearly everything, from harvests to star positions, the mummy makers were mostly invisible. They didn't carve their names into tombs. They didn't write scrolls about their methods. Most were never depicted in art. When they did appear, it was often as nameless figures in the background, handling jars or tending to linen. This wasn't just cultural erasure, it was deliberate. Embalmers were kept in the margins, needed but never celebrated. Their craft was essential, yet considered unclean. Their expertise unmatched, but their identities disposable. They were buried in common graves when they were buried at all. Often their own mummification was rushed or omitted entirely. Their bodies, like their lives, were treated as something functional, something necessary, but not something to be remembered. Even in death they served. Their absence in the written record has led many to believe that mummification was a clean, sacred ritual performed by priests in temples. The truth was far more brutal. It was a job, a physically and emotionally destructive job, and someone had to do it. Some embalmers may have found small comfort in their routines, in the motions of wrapping, oiling and sealing. Others likely hardened into resignation. There's no evidence of rebellion, of mass refusal. Perhaps they felt chosen, or trapped, or simply born into a role they could never escape. But make no mistake, the life of a mummy maker was a sacrifice, not of the grand, ceremonial kind, but the slow, corrosive kind, the kind that eats away at your body, that cuts you off from society, that stains your skin, your breath, your soul. And in the end, what did they get? Not glory, not gold, just more bodies. The ancient Egyptian obsession with death was never about endings. It was about what came after, the journey of the soul, the trials in the underworld, and the hope for eternity in the field of reeds. For the wealthy and powerful, mummification was their passport. A preserved body meant an undisturbed soul. But for the mummy makers, death wasn't a philosophical concept or a spiritual mystery. It was a job soaked in blood, bile, and bitterness. They didn't have the luxury of thinking about the afterlife. They were too busy removing pus from bloated intestines, too busy dragging decomposing bodies off riverboats, too busy picking out larvae from eye sockets. Their world was here, in the land of the living, surrounded by the dead. And still, the demands never slowed. The embalmers saw the contradictions clearly. They worked for men who feared death, but wouldn't dare speak to the people who touched it. The rich wanted to be gods in death, but they hired those they treated like the lowest form of life to make it happen. And once the wrappings were complete, once the masks were placed and the rituals performed, the mummy makers vanished. The priests took over. The crowds mourned. The family wept. No one mentioned who prepared the body, who endured the filth, the pain, the isolation. There were no thanks, no rewards, no recognition, only the next corpse. Even the tools they used outlived them. Embalming hooks and knives were passed down, not as heirlooms of honor, but as burdens of survival. A boy born to a mummy maker rarely had a choice. From the moment he could walk, he smelled natron. He heard the squelch of rotten flesh. He saw things no child should ever see. And in time, he became numb to them, or he left if he was lucky. Some tried to escape, to take up other trades, but society didn't forget. The stink stayed with them. The rumors followed. Once marked by death, always marked. A man who once touched the dead would always be impure. It was a brand, invisible but irreversible. And yet, despite all this, the horror, the rejection, the endless suffering, the embalmers endured. Why? Maybe because the work gave them a twisted kind of purpose. Maybe because no one else would do it. Or maybe because, deep down, they believed that helping others reach the afterlife might earn them mercy in their own death. Maybe that's what they clung to as their fingers wrapped another set of bandages, as their lungs burned from another pot of boiling resin, as their names were forgotten while the names of the dead were carved in stone. If there's a lesson buried beneath the linen and salt, it's this. The architects of immortality were men who lived with none. They handled the worst of death so others could be remembered forever. They gave their health, their dignity, and their lives to build a bridge between the living and the divine, a bridge that history crossed without ever turning back to look at who built it. So the next time you walk through a museum, past a perfectly preserved mummy in a glass case, stop. Look closer. Look past the golden mask and linen wraps, past the hieroglyphs and canopic jars. Behind all of it is a story of hands, rough, burned, trembling, that made eternity possible. Hands that belonged to someone who spent their life with the dead, so others could be remembered forever.